Welcome, Grade 9 students, to this explainer. Today, we're stepping completely out of our everyday human-sized world and shrinking all the way down into the soil. We're going to explore something absolutely fascinating, the hidden, almost magical, microscopic world of fungi. We're tracing the entire life cycle of a mushroom, from a literally invisible speck to that familiar shape you see popping up in the forest right after a rainstorm. It's just a brilliant story of biology, and I am so excited to share it with you all.
Okay, let's dive into this, because right away we have to challenge a really common assumption. When we think about how things grow in nature, we almost automatically think of plants and seeds, right? You plant a seed, you get a flower, or maybe a tree. But mushrooms, they are not plants. If you were to slice open a mushroom, there is no way you'd ever find a seed hidden inside. So how on earth do they multiply? How does one single mushroom become a massive patch of them in the forest?
Well, the answer is entirely different from what you might expect. Fungi actually belong to a completely different kingdom of life than plants, and because of that, they play by their own unique rules. Instead of using complex multicellular seeds to reproduce, mushrooms use spores. Think about it. Seeds contain a tiny, pre-formed plant embryo and a built-in food supply, all wrapped in a protective coat. Spores, on the other hand, they're incredibly tiny. They are essentially single cells that carry the genetic blueprint of the fungus. They're microscopic, super lightweight, and honestly just completely different from the seeds you'd plant in a vegetable garden.
To truly wrap our heads around this, we're going to follow a clear roadmap. First, we'll meet the fruiting body. Then, we'll look at spore release and germination, followed by forming the primary mycelium. After that, we'll hit the crucial fusion, growing the new mushroom, and finally, how the cycle continues. So, let's travel from the visible world down into the dirt.
Step 1. Meet the fruiting body, otherwise known as the visible mushroom.
When you're walking through the woods and you spot a mushroom, what you're actually looking at is scientifically called the fruiting body. It's really just the above-ground temporary structure of a much, much larger organism. Notice the key structures here on a mature fruiting body. You've got the stalk, which lifts it right up off the ground. There's the cap, acting almost like an umbrella. But the absolute most important part for our story today is located just underneath that cap, the gills. Those tiny paper-like ridges, that is exactly where all the reproductive magic happens.
Which brings us to Phase 2, spore release and germination, where the journey actually begins.
The journey of a new mushroom starts deep within those gills we just talked about. That is where millions upon millions of microscopic spores are being produced. Once they're fully mature, the mushroom just lets them go. And because they're so incredibly light, they get easily caught by the wind, washed away in raindrops, or even hitch a ride on passing animals. Just imagine millions of invisible specks floating through the air. They are essentially playing a massive biological lottery here, because most of them won't survive. They're desperately waiting to land on a surface that has the absolute perfect combination of moisture and a suitable environment so they can wake up and actually start to grow.
Let's zoom our microscopic lenses all the way in now. When one of those incredibly lucky spores finally lands in a moist, perfect spot, it germinates. But it doesn't just instantly pop into a tiny mushroom. Instead, that single spore cracks open and pushes out a tiny, microscopic tube. This brings us to a vital vocabulary word for today, hypha. A hypha is a single thread-like structure. It's the very first stage of underground fungal growth, stretching out into the soil, just hunting for nutrients.
That takes us to Step 3. Forming the primary mycelium, our underground network.
You see, that single hypha we just mentioned doesn't stay a single thread for very long. As it consumes nutrients from its moist environment, it grows and it branches out, again and again. These branching threads stack and weave together to create this complex, web-like network in the soil. We call this entire network of hyphae, all originating from that one single germinated spore, the primary mycelium. You can kind of think of it like a microscopic root system just spreading out under the dirt.
But right here, we hit a massive biological plot twist in our story. You might think this growing network will just keep getting bigger and bigger until a mushroom pops out, right? Well, it won't. The primary mycelium living all by itself in the soil is fundamentally incomplete. No matter how big it grows or how much food it eats, primary mycelium alone absolutely cannot produce a mushroom. It is biologically impossible. It's actually waiting for something.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we solve that mystery. Step 4, the crucial fusion, creating secondary mycelium.
So, here is the exact solution to that plot twist.
Under the cover of darkness, incredibly deep in the soil, our primary mycelium is spreading out. Eventually, its microscopic threads bump into the threads of another primary mycelium that grew from a completely different spore. But they can't just be any two random networks. They must be compatible mating types, which scientists refer to as the plus and minus types. When a plus and a minus primary mycelium finally meet, their threads literally fuse together. They combine their cellular material to form something entirely new, which we call the secondary mycelium. This new, fused network is much stronger, highly resilient, and incredibly long-lived.
So, the crucial point is this. Only the secondary mycelium is capable of producing a fruiting body. The primary mycelium was literally just the setup. It's only after that microscopic fusion of the plus and minus types that the fungus gains the biological blueprints and, frankly, the sheer power necessary to eventually build a mushroom. Without the secondary mycelium, the story just stops dead in the dirt.
But once we have it, we move to step 5, growing the new mushroom and breaking the surface.
Once that powerful secondary mycelium is firmly established, it requires very specific, favorable conditions for growth to begin building a mushroom. We're talking about a surge of adequate moisture, which, by the way, is exactly why mushrooms seem to magically appear out of nowhere after a heavy rain, a suitable temperature, plenty of oxygen, and a really rich supply of nutrients in the soil. When all of those exact conditions perfectly align, the mycelium kicks right into high gear.
The underground network starts pushing all this moisture and nutrients to one specific location, knotting its threads together super tightly until a tiny, solid structure forms. And then, this structure pushes powerfully up through the soil, breaking the surface into the light. We call this early, tightly packed phase the button stage. It almost looks like a little white pebble resting on the dirt. But it is growing so rapidly, expanding outward and upward, drawing incredible amounts of energy from that secondary mycelium below, until the stalk lengthens and the cap finally opens up wide.
And this brilliantly illustrates our final step. Step 6, the cycle continues, repeating the process. Because the very second that cap opens up, the mushroom is already hard at work. Those gills underneath the cap of the mature fruiting body are actively producing a brand new generation of spores. The stalk holds them up high so the wind can catch them, and boom, millions of new spores are released back into the environment. They drift away looking for a moist surface to germinate into a hypha, grow into primary mycelium, fuse into secondary mycelium, and eventually push up another mushroom. It is a beautiful, continuous loop of fungal life repeating itself perfectly.
We've covered a lot of ground today in this explainer, from the visible caps and gills all the way down to the complex fusion of microscopic threads. So I want to leave you with this thought. Next time you see a mushroom sitting quietly in the grass or maybe on a log in the wild, don't just look at the surface. Ask yourself, what vast, invisible, microscopic network of mycelium is living, breathing, and communicating right beneath your feet to make that single mushroom possible? It really makes you realize that in biology, the most powerful forces are often the ones we can't even see. Keep wondering, keep learning, and thank you so much.